Hello, this is Kylie, and welcome back to Fem and Flow. I hope you're having a wonderful day. In the last episode, we traced the paradox of America, how it was seeded as a new Atlantis, a spiral node meant to restore coherence, but how blueprint and inversion were woven into it from the very beginning. We talked about why America still matters and how it remains a planetary crucible where freedom, gnosis, and inversion all collide. But before we can move into the restoration of the blueprint, there's something we need to face clearly, and that is the false spiral. Because if the true spiral is the path of remembering, the return to source, coherence, and integration, then the false spiral is its counterfeit. It's what happens when the form of the spiral is imitated, but the tone is missing. It looks like progress, but it loops. It looks like initiation, but it traps. In this episode, we're going to unpack what the false spiral is, how it shows up in history, culture, spirituality, and even in our personal lives. Because learning to discern between the true and the false spiral is absolutely essential before we can restore the divine blueprint. So let's begin with the true spiral, what the spiral really is. In its original design, what I call the divine integration program, the spiral was the structure of remembrance. 12 archetypal tones, 12 frequencies of consciousness, woven into one integrated self. The spiral wasn't linear and it wasn't hierarchical. It was rhythmic, fluid, unfolding in stages of coherence. Each initiation, each remembrance brought you closer to wholeness. In Whitehole coherence, the spiral expanded naturally. Forgetting was temporary, remembering was joyful, and the body became the architecture of light. In black hole physics, the spiral inverted. Forgetting became amnesia, remembering became heresy, and the body was turned into commodity and control. The spiral has always been the path. The question is, are we spiraling into coherence or spiraling into distortion? Now let's talk about the false spiral defined. The false spiral is what happens when inversion imitates the form but strips out the tone. Inversion doesn't originate, it copies. It takes the sacred pattern and hollows it out. It keeps the outer structure, cycles, rituals, steps, levels, but removes the living current of source. So instead of leading to coherence, the false spiral leads to repetition. Instead of remembrance, it creates striving. Instead of integration, it creates loops. The false spiral is why so many people feel like they're doing the work endlessly, but never arriving. Why entire societies can keep repeating the same cycles: war, empire, collapse, and call it progress. It's initiation without gnosis, form without tone, symbol without embodiment. Now let's talk about some historical examples of the false spiral. The first one is religion. At its root, the Christ dream was pure light. Yeshua and Mary Magdalene embodied the true spiral. Resurrection not as a one-time miracle, but as the template of coherence, the union of masculine and feminine, life reborn through embodiment. Their transmission was about gnosis, direct access to source, lived in the body, available to all. But when Rome co-opted the Christ stream, the light was stripped and inverted. Resurrection was reframed as atonement. Instead of embodiment, the spiral was recast as endless sacrifice and guilt. Humanity was placed in a loop, born in sin, needing forgiveness, outsourcing salvation to priests and institutions. The feminine was erased, gnosis condemned as heresy, and authority centralized in hierarchy. The form of the spiral was still there: ritual, liturgy, sacraments, but without tone. What began as a path of union became the false spiral: repetition without resolution, a cycle designed to keep people bound instead of set free. The next example is esoteric brotherhoods. Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, even Templar offshoots began as genuine carriers of light. They preserved sacred geometry, ritual, and fragments of gnosis during times when truth was being burned or suppressed. In their origin, these streams were about alignment with Source, the craft of building, not just in stone, but in human character and coherence. But over time, as the feminine was excluded, the spiral dimmed. Without tone to lead, the field was only half lit. What began as initiations into wholeness gradually hardened into hierarchy. Degrees, symbols, and rituals remained, but the living current was stripped. The spiral's form was still there, but the tone was missing. And without tone, what could have generated coherence ended up recycling power instead. The next example is America. The seeding itself began in light. America was envisioned as the new Atlantis, a node of freedom, a fresh convergence point where gnosis, science, and spirit could realign. It carried the dream of liberty, self governance, and the chance to restore the spiral outside the grip of empire. The ideals of equality, freedom of conscience, and collective flourishing were genuine fragments of the divine blueprint. But almost immediately, that light was stripped and inverted. Freedom was compromised by slavery. Prosperity was built on land theft and extraction. Equality was spoken in words but denied in practice. Women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans excluded from the promise. The form of the spiral was still there: constitutions, symbols, sacred geometry etched into city grids, but the tone was missing. Without feminine integration, without indigenous gnosis honored, the current bent back into hierarchy. So the experiment became the false spiral. Liberty hardened into individualism, prosperity devolved into consumerism, and unity collapsed into nationalism. The architecture reflected coherence, but the embodiment recycled empire. The node was real, but it bent the moment it touched matter. Now let's talk about modern examples of the false spiral. The false spiral isn't just a historical artifact, it's everywhere in modern culture. The first example is consumerism. Upgrade culture is a false spiral, always chasing the next phone, the next car, the next house, the next vacation. On the surface, it feels like motion, but underneath, it's the same loop: desire, purchase, temporary satisfaction, then emptiness again. Prosperity is mimicked in form, but the essence of abundance as divine flow is missing. And here's the paradox: it's not wrong for the soul to long for beauty, comfort, or even luxury. In its true expression, abundance is natural. The soul delights in color, texture, design, and the joy of creation made visible. Beauty is meant to be a reflection of Source, an overflow of coherence into form. And that's why consumerism works as a false spiral, because it hijacks something real. The desire for abundance is true. The distortion is that instead of arising from flow, it's sourced from lack. Instead of beauty as a natural overflow, it becomes a performance of status, an endless chase to fill the void of disconnection. So the false spiral of consumerism is not that it offers beauty, but that it divorces beauty from coherence. It teaches us to grasp for form without tone, to collect objects without resonance. True prosperity is never accumulation. It's circulation, generosity, and alignment with flow. The false spiral strips that, leaving only the hollow shell of upgrade culture. The next example is spirituality, and this one is big. Inverted spirituality often sells the false spiral as initiation. Endless workshops, activations, retreats, gurus, always promising the next level, but leaving people dependent on external authority. The true spiral points you inward. Gnosis in your body, your tone, your direct connection to source. The false spiral keeps you chasing keys that someone else is holding. And here's the paradox: true initiation is real. Retreats, teachings, and guides can play a sacred role in catalyzing remembrance. The soul naturally seeks teachers, mirrors, and community on the path. It's part of how we learn and spiral upward together. But when the authority of the teacher eclipses the authority of your own inner knowing, it bends into inversion. The external container is meant to point you back to your own body, your own gnosis, your own source. Instead, the false spiral of spiritual consumerism creates dependence. It mimics initiation but strips out resolution, leaving seekers circling, paying, yearning for the next fix instead of stabilizing in coherence. The next modern example of the false spiral is self help and hustle culture. Leveling up, 10x your life, grind until you make it. These are classic false spiral phases. They imitate the upward movement of initiation, but actually trap you in inadequacy and endless striving. You're always almost there, but never enough. And here's the paradox: growth is real. The soul naturally longs to expand, to unfold new potentials, to embody more of its blueprint. Discipline, effort, and practice can be sacred. They help us anchor vision into form. But when growth gets hijacked into hustle, the spiral bends. Instead of unfolding from coherence, it feeds on lack. I'll be worthy once I get there. The true spiral is fueled by joy and alignment, where expansion arises from resonance. The false spiral of hustle culture keeps you chasing external validation, mistaking exhaustion for evolution, and mistaking endless motion for true initiation. The next example is relationships. Karmic cycles and trauma loops often mimic initiation. Intense, dramatic, repetitive, they feel like soul contracts or growth, but unless integration happens, they're just false spiral loops, pain recycled instead of transmuted. And yet, here's the paradox: relationships are one of the deepest mirrors of the spiral. They awaken shadow, trigger wounds, and call forth parts of us that can't surface alone. That tension is not false. It's part of how we remember and rebalance polarity. But when the pattern becomes addictive, when the drama itself is mistaken for growth, the spiral collapses into repetition. True spiral relationships generate coherence. They move through conflict into deeper resonance, weaving both polarities into harmony. False spiral relationships keep recycling the same lesson, keeping the field fractured instead of integrated. Now let's talk about the mechanics of the false spiral. How does it work? It feeds on amnesia and striving. You forget your wholeness and then endlessly strive to find it outside yourself. It substitutes form for tone, symbols, rituals, steps, but the living current is missing. It loops. Instead of resolution, you cycle through the same lessons without integration. It excludes the feminine. The spiral cannot hold if tone, the feminine current, is absent. That's why almost every false spiral is patriarchal, hierarchical, or externalized. Now let's talk about the false spiral as energy siphon. Here's something else about the false spiral. It isn't neutral, it's parasitic. The false spiral doesn't just mimic the true spiral by accident. It thrives on the looping. Every time you're caught in endless striving, guilt, or repetition without resolution, your energy is being siphoned. Whether through empire, institutions, consumer cycles, or even distorted spiritual containers, the loop itself becomes the mechanism of extraction. Think about it. In consumerism, every crash after the high creates more craving, and that craving keeps you spending, feeding systems built on lack. In hustle culture, exhaustion becomes a badge of honor. But that exhaustion is literally your life force being drained into structures that profit from your depletion. In inverted religion, guilt keeps you outsourcing your power, fueling hierarchies that depend on you never feeling whole. The pattern is the same. Loops generate leakage. The body, when trapped in repetition, leaks life force. Cortisol, adrenaline, shame, craving, all of these states bleed energy. And that's exactly what inversion feeds on. This is why the false spiral never resolves. Resolution would end the siphon. Coherence would end the drain. So instead, the false spiral imitates progress while keeping you circling, generating loose frequency for systems of control to harvest. And here's the key. Embodiment collapses the siphon. When you root coherence in the body, when the nervous system settles, the breath opens, the fascia flows, the loop breaks. Energy stops leaking. Instead of being siphoned, your life force recirculates. Flow replaces extraction. You become self-sustaining. This is sovereignty at the energetic level. Discernment doesn't just protect your mind, it seals your field. Embodiment doesn't just restore coherence, it starves inversion. So the false spiral isn't only something to spot out there in culture or history. It's something to notice in your own energy economy. Are you leaking or are you flowing? Are you spiraling in coherence or looping in siphon? That choice, moment by moment, is what reclaims your field from inversion. Now let's talk about the false spiral within. Up to this point, we've been talking about the false spiral in culture, religion, history, and relationships. But here's the part that's even more important. The false spiral isn't just out there, it lives inside us too. Every time you feel like you're looping in the same self doubt, the same perfectionism, the same cycle of almost enough but not quite, that's the false spiral running internally. It uses the same mechanics: form without tone, striving without resolution. Think about it. The inner critic that always moves the goalpost. No matter how much you accomplish, it tells you you're still not there. That's a false spiral. The perfectionism that makes you polish and polish but never actually feel complete. That's a false spiral too. Even the obsession with fixing yourself through endless self-help can become a loop. Healing is real, initiation is real, but when it comes from the belief that you're broken and need to be fixed before you're whole, it bends into inversion. And here's the subtle trick. The false spiral inside doesn't usually feel dramatic. It feels normal. It whispers, work harder, be better, one more step, one more tweak. It's quiet enough that you think you're growing, but instead of integrating, you're recycling the same feeling of lack. Even spirituality can get caught in this. You might meditate, journal, or pray from a place of fear, trying to escape discomfort or control the path instead of opening to flow. On the surface, it looks like devotion, but underneath, it's a loop, trying to ascend while your body is still braced in survival mode. The true spiral feels completely different. It doesn't say fix yourself until you're worthy. It says you are whole, and from that wholeness, you expand. It doesn't drain you, it nourishes you. Your nervous system feels more spacious, your breath opens, your cells feel alive. That's how you know the spiral is real. It generates coherence instead of demanding exhaustion. So, yes, the full spiral shows up in religion, government, and culture. But the deepest initiation is seeing how it plays out in you. Once you see those micro loops inside yourself, you can reclaim them. You can stop outsourcing worth to the critic or the hustle. You can stop mistaking fear driven striving for growth. You can let tone lead and embody coherence from the inside out. Because that's where restoration begins. Not just in dismantling false spirals outside of us, but in refusing to let them live inside us. Now let's talk about how to recognize the false spiral. The simplest test is resonance. Does it generate or does it drain? The true spiral expands you. You feel coherence, creativity, energy. The false spiral drains you. You feel depleted, dependent, or trapped. Other markers are the true spiral points you back to gnosis. The false spiral outsources your authority. The true spiral integrates and moves forward. The false spiral repeats without resolution. The true spiral honors both feminine and masculine. The false spiral strips out the feminine or reduces her to symbol. Now let's talk about balancing polarity and seeing the paradox. Recognizing the false spiral isn't just about spotting what drains you. It's also about training your vision to hold polarity, to see both sides of the pattern at once. Every distortion starts with the truth. That's why it's so seductive. Take consumerism. On the surface, it's endless buying, upgrading, and chasing. But underneath is the soul's real desire for abundance and beauty, the natural spiral impulse to live in divine flow, surrounded by harmony. The shadow bends that truth into accumulation, but the essence is still sacred. We are meant to live in abundance, just not in extraction. Or look at hustle culture. Level up, grind harder. At its core, that's the human spirit remembering its drive to grow, create, and expand. The true spiral celebrates that growth, but it does it through integration, not exhaustion. The shadow twists expansion into striving, and the spiral bends into depletion. Relationships, too. Karmic loops can feel like destiny, like they're pulling us through initiation. But often, what's happening is that the mirror of wholeness is being bent into repetition. The true spiral of union asks us to integrate, to bring both poles, masculine and feminine, self and other, into coherence. Without that integration, the loop just recycles pain. Even religion itself. The false spiral tells us salvation comes only through guilt, hierarchy, and external authority. But at its root was gnosis, the true spiral of divine union, where resurrection means embodiment, not endless atonement. The distortion bends the same truth, but removes the feminine and strips the spiral of resolution. When we collapse into one pole, we lose the spiral. We mistake consumption for abundance, striving for growth, hierarchy for God. But when we can hold paradox, when we can see how a shadow bends the light, we stop being fooled. This is why shifting paradigm lenses matters. From the black hole paradigm, life looks like hierarchy, survival, competition. From the bridge paradigm, we began to glimpse that these distortions are loops, not truths. From the white hole paradigm, we see the coherence underneath, that every false spiral is just a bent reflection of the true one. So the practice is not to reject everything that looks distorted, but to ask, what true spiral tone is the shadow imitating? What is the seed of truth here? Once you see that, the false spiral loses its grip. You can reclaim the original function instead of outsourcing it. You can draw out the original current, integrate it, and step back into coherence. This is how discernment deepens. Not just saying, this drains me, but seeing the full polarity, how truth bends into distortion, how shadow hides inside light. When you can hold both, you can step out of the loop and back into coherence. That's the deeper art of discernment. Not just labeling something good or bad, but holding the paradox, seeing both sides, and choosing alignment. Now let's talk about the false spiral in the body. Here's where all of it comes home. The false spiral isn't just out there in religion, culture, or institutions. It plays out in the body. Think about it. Every false spiral leaves an imprint on the nervous system, the fascia, even the DNA. In consumerism, the loop of desire and emptiness shows up as constant cortisol spikes, craving, chasing, then crashing. The fascia tightens, the breath shortens, the body never lands in the flow of enough. In hustle culture, the loop of striving manifests as chronic overdrive. The nervous system stays locked in fight or flight, mistaking exhaustion for growth. The body forgets how to rest, how to integrate, how to feel coherence. In relationships, karmic loops live in the fascia and the womb space. Trauma gets stored in tissues, and without integration, the body keeps repeating the same relational patterns. It's why certain dynamics feel faded. The body is looping until the tone shifts. In religion and esoteric orders, the erasure of the feminine shows up as disconnection from the womb, from the breath, from direct gnosis in the body. Instead of the body as temple, the body becomes a commodity or a problem to transcend. This is why the body is the key to discernment. The mind can be tricked, symbols can be co opted, rituals can be inverted, words can be bent, but the body feels truth. When you're in the true spiral, the nervous system settles, the breath opens, your cells hum with coherence. When you're in the false spiral, your body tells you tightness, depletion, dependency, craving without satisfaction. The body is not just part of the spiral, it's the architecture where the spiral either loops or restores. That's why embodiment is not optional on this path. It's how we move from the false spiral into the true one. Now let's talk about mind control versus embodied flow. One of the biggest tricks of inversion is that it convinces us the spiral can be controlled by the mind. It tells us, just think positive, just visualize harder, just believe the right ideas and you'll ascend. And yes, the mind is powerful. Thought and intention shape reality. But if the spiral stays in the head, it never roots, it loops. This is the masculine without the feminine, form without tone, structure without flow. The false spiral pushes us into control, discipline without embodiment, intellect without resonance, love and light as a concept rather than a lived current in the cells. It keeps us in our heads, chasing spiritual ideas while our bodies remain locked in contraction and our nervous systems in survival mode. The true spiral doesn't bypass the mind, but it doesn't stop there. It roots in the body. It flows. It's the feminine principle leading breath, womb, fascia, vibration, and then the masculine follows, giving form and action to what is already coherent within. This is why it's not enough to think about God or imagine coherence or speak the right affirmations. You have to embody source. You have to feel coherence humming in your blood, your bones, your breath. That's the difference. The false spiral is mind over body, control over flow, ideas without embodiment. The true spiral is body as temple, tone leading form, source incarnated, not just imagined. And this is why love and light as a thought can fall flat. But love embodied in your nervous system, light embodied in your DNA, coherence embodied in your fascia, that's unshakable. That can't be hijacked. The spiral was never meant to be managed by the mind alone. It was meant to be lived through tone, breath, rhythm, coherence, embodiment. Now let's talk about the nervous system, where frequency becomes flesh. This is where we can see how the false spiral and the true spiral actually play out in our biology. The false spiral stays trapped in the mind, and when that happens, the nervous system never stabilizes. You can think positive thoughts all day, but if your body is stuck in fight or flight, your frequency is still survival. Your tone can't lead if your fascia is braced, your breath is shallow, or your womb field is frozen. That's why the false spiral loves the mind. It keeps you in concepts while your body remains locked in loops. The true spiral, on the other hand, roots through the nervous system. When you breathe deeply, release fascia tension, open the diaphragm, regulate your vagus nerve, your whole body shifts into parasympathetic coherence. And in that state, your cells actually begin to entrain to source. Your heart field expands, your fascia transmits vibration, your mitochondria light up with ATP, the literal spark of life. The body is designed to entrain frequency. When tone leads, when the feminine spiral of flow, breath, and vibration is embodied, the masculine can stabilize it as structure, thought, and action. Coherence becomes lived, not imagined. So here's the deeper paradox. You can't think your way into coherence, but your nervous system will carry you there if you let it. The body is the portal. The breath is the bridge. The fascia is the wiring. The womb is the wellspring. And when you embody source through these living systems, you are no longer chasing the spiral in your mind. You are spiraling in resonance. This is what inversion doesn't want you to know. Your body is the one place it can't fully hijack unless you give it away. That's why the false spiral pushes control, ideology, and hierarchy, all mind-based systems. Because once you embody, you're free. Now let's talk about why this matters before restoration. We can't talk about restoring the divine blueprint until we can clearly see what has bent it. Because the false spiral doesn't just disappear when we want to ascend. It follows us, imitates the path, and even disguises itself as restoration. It sells progress while keeping us looping in hierarchy, guilt, or exhaustion. That's why discernment itself is initiation. Naming the counterfeit is part of the spiral. You have to feel the difference between form without tone and form infused with tone. Between repetition and resolution. Between love and light as an idea in the mind and love and light embodied in the breath, fascia, womb, and nervous system. Because here's the deeper truth: the full spiral is almost always mind led. It tells you that if you just think harder, visualize better, or believe the right dogma, you'll get there. But the body doesn't lie. If your nervous system is still in survival mode, if your fascia is still braced, if your breath is shallow, you're still looping no matter what the mind believes. The true spiral is body led. It doesn't bypass the mind, but it roots coherence in flesh first. Breath expands, fascia opens, mitochondria light up, the nervous system hums with safety. Tone leads, and then the mind follows, giving form to what the body already knows. That's why embodiment is not optional. The spiral can't be restored as a concept, or as a political project, or as an external institution. It has to be restored as a lived current in the body. The womb, the breath, the fascia, the nervous system, these are the new templates where source anchors. So why does this matter before restoration? Because if we try to move forward without discerning the false spiral, we'll carry its patterns with us. We'll build new systems that look like freedom but repeat hierarchy. We'll preach love without embodying it. We'll confuse motion for coherence. Seeing the false spiral in history, in culture, and in our own tissues is the threshold. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you choose to embody the true spiral, you step out of repetition and into resolution. Only then are we ready to talk about restoring the blueprint. So here's the truth: the false spiral is everywhere. It's in history and religion, in brotherhoods and governments, in consumerism and hustle culture, even in our own relationships and spiritual paths. And it's not always obvious because it mimics the real. It borrows the form of the spiral but without tone. That's why it can feel like progress while actually looping us in exhaustion, guilt, or lack. But here's the good news: once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you feel it in your body, the difference between depletion and coherence, between mind control and embodied flow, you know. You can name the counterfeits and you can choose the real. That's where we're headed next. Because if the false spiral teaches us what doesn't work, hierarchy, outsourcing, repetition, then the true spiral reminds us what it does: embodiment, gnosis, coherence. The spiral restored is not an idea, not an institution, not another external promise. It is the body itself becoming the architecture of source again. In the next episode, we'll begin the blueprint restored. We'll explore how the spiral is coming back online through DNA reactivation, how the feminine is returning as tone setter, and how the nervous system, fascia, womb, and breath are becoming the new temples of light. Because yes, the false spiral has held sway for a long time, but the true spiral is rising again. And this time, it's not rising in monuments or institutions. It's rising in us. So that's all I have for this episode. Stay tuned for the next part where we start a new arc and go from the hijacked blueprint to the blueprint restored. And if you want behind the veil episodes, go to my Patreon and subscribe. I'd love to see you there. And that's all. I love you all and have a great week.